Right, good morning, good afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this, one of the final sessions of the Global Landscape Forum conference that's been ongoing this week. I'd like to give you my very, very strong welcome to this conference, and this session is on greening the food systems and accelerating the transition to environmental sustainability. A very, very important and critical topic at this time. My name is Chris Brett. I'm the session moderator. And I work with the World Bank, and I'm the lead business specialist. And it's a great privilege to welcome a very, very good and strong and diverse panel across the supply chain with lots of different interests in this area. So I would just like to say that panel, we have Martien van Nieuwkoop, who is the Global Director of the Food and Agriculture at the World Bank. We have Mohamed Bakar, the lead environmental specialist at the Global Environment Facility. We have Bernard Giraud, who is the president of the Livelihoods Venture Fund. We have Craig Hansen, the vice president. We've got Tanya, the service in the manufacturing, agribusiness and service sector. And we have Christopher Stuart, Dr. Christopher Stuart, who's the senior president of Global of Sustainability for Olam International. So, you're most welcome. We're really looking forward to your inputs, and thank you very much for joining this panel and giving time. And at this stage, I'm going to go to Martien van Nieuwkoop to basically set the scene and give us a very brief presentation and lead to start the conversation. So over to you, Martien. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Let me just pull up my presentation, and I hope that everybody can see that now. Thank you very much.
Clearly.
Very good. Okay, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be part of this session on accelerating the transition to environmental sustainability. And I'm very pleased to set the stage for an in-depth conversation. I mean, with all the panelists that you have indicated, Chris. So let me start. Let me first say, and this comes from a report prepared by FOLU and released last year, that the global food system is not fit for purpose. I mean, this is our kind of a point of departure. 2 billion people are undernourished and malnourished. I mean, 2 billion people are overweight and obese. About 1/3 of agriculture, global agriculture production is lost and wasted. The sector accounts for about 25% of greenhouse gas emissions. And also the global food system, agriculture is a very big driver, if the biggest driver of biodiversity loss in the world. If you factor in, I mean, those hidden costs of the global food system, it adds up to about $12 trillion. So this is a very big number, particularly if you compare it to the market value of the global food system, this is $10 trillion. So as the situation right now, the global food system is actually subtracting value rather than adding value. So this is where we are. And of course, this is also the situation when COVID-19 hit the world. And what we see is that COVID-19 is accentuating and amplifying many of the food system weaknesses. I mean, think about the zoonotic nature of COVID-19 and also the pandemics that we have seen over the last 20 years, many of them of zoonotic nature. Of course, animal-human transmissions occur when agriculture and food system encroach on natural habitats, raising the risk of zoonotic diseases. Of course, it also makes very clear the link between poor diets, compromised immune systems because of undernourishment or because of obesity associated with non-communicable diseases, pre-existing conditions, and a link with COVID-19 morbidity. So amplifying, I mean, the need, to focus moving forward on healthier diets. COVID-19 also, if you look at all the disruptions of the food supply chains, it points in the direction of, its vulnerability to those disruptions and the lack of resilience. And of course, COVID-19 is also hitting countries that are already affected by other extreme events like drought and locust, and those also have a link with climate change and the vulnerability of the food system. Of course, the major challenges, of the food system remain. This was laid out in a report that the World Resources Institute published about 1.5 years ago, creating a sustainable food future. And those challenges are indeed daunting. The world needs 56% more food, to feed almost 10 billion people by 2050. At the same time, we need to avoid, because with business as usual, that would require about 600 million more hectares of land, twice the size of India. And of course, if that would happen, it would signify represent huge deforestation that needs to be avoided. Also, the greenhouse gas emissions of the sector currently are about 12 gigatons per year. With business as usual, this will grow to 15, while the carbon budget of the sector in line with the 2-degree world would only be 4 gigatons by 2050. So major transformation is needed, while also the need to kind of build resilience of the global food system, giving it disproportionate use of water, and many farms in the world are already facing water stress. So what we need is to transition to a sustainable food system that contributes to healthy people, healthy planet, and a healthy economy. The pathways for that are the ability of the agriculture sector to provide inclusive growth, as well as to generate nutritional outcomes that are very relevant for human capital, and of course to provide nature-based solutions. The World Bank is very much, the World Bank Group is very much engaged on this agenda by providing support for investments, getting incentives right. This is a very big part of our policy dialogue. Focusing on target interventions for the poor and vulnerable, strengthening institutions, fostering innovation, as well as mobilizing needed knowledge and information. To reflect our focus on food systems, the name of the agriculture and global practice actually was changed last year, July 1st, to agriculture and food global practice. Reflecting this transition from a focus from agriculture to food system with the idea to contribute to healthy people, healthy planet, and healthy economy. Of course, we think that the food, and of course, a very important area to focus on is to make sure that the incentives are right, for farmers and all the stakeholders to invest in sustainable agriculture that provide nutritional outcomes. In this respect, the public support that is provided, to the agriculture sector to the tune of $570 billion per year is very important, particularly, as I said earlier, that support is provided, despite the fact that the global food system actually is subtracting value rather than adding value. And what you can see in this pie chart is that most of those public support is not going to public goods and environmental purposes, only 17%. The rest is going to market price support, production payments, and input subsidies. And we know from literature and from experience, that those support is not very effective, leading to many allocative inefficiencies, farmers not growing the right crop in relation to the right agroecological conditions, many technical inefficiencies. So farmers using too much water in relation to their production level, as well as many negative environmental externalities. Think about nitrogen leaching and air pollution caused by overuse of nitrogen. So those resources could be used much more effectively by linking them to positive environmental outcomes, where we actually reward farmers to provide ecosystem services. In our vision for a global food system that supports healthy people, healthy economy, and healthy planet, farmers in the 21st century should not just be producers of food, but also providers of ecosystem services. We think that the Food Systems Land Use and Restoration Impact Program, FOLUR, can spearhead this transformation of the global food system. FOLUR is financed by the Global Environmental Facility, and the bank is coordinating the global platform of that program, which comprises 27 country projects with 8 GLF implementing agencies. GLF is providing about $300 million for this initiative, and countries in the World Bank are mobilizing an additional 2.7 to have a $3 billion program to support sustainable value chains and food system, to make supply chains deforestation-free, and support landscape restoration. Also very important, that the program takes a value chain approach by focusing on 8 commodities. I mean that when it comes to deforestation, take account a lot of the agriculture sector pressure on the world's primary forests. I mean, this was also the reason why those commodities were selected, as you see in this screen. And I think the follower is unique in it actually tries to link sustainable landscape management with the agriculture value chain approach, bringing in all the necessary stakeholders, but also the ability to work both on the demand side and the supply side of this equation, and to translate, I mean, this global vision for a sustainable and nutritious food system into practice by focusing on those eight commodities. Of course, I mean, this is a program with very many important partners, as indicated here, and we're working very productively and constructively in moving this agenda forward in the context of Lure. With that, back to you, Chris. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Martin. I mean, that's an awful lot of information in such a limited amount of time, so we really appreciate your inputs there. It is really, really amazing when you look at the hidden costs of the food system. We should be looking at food system as value addition or addition to society, not negative to society. So these are really strong points and very strong numbers that are coming out. It's been really fascinating over the last few months or the last year or so, following a lot of the issues that has been going on around commitments to deforestation, commitments to eliminating deforestation from a lot of the supply chains that we take for granted in our society. Then the big question is, what is really happening? Are we delivering? Commitments being made, commitments by 2020 were supposed to be achieved. I mean, we're 6 months off from the end of 2020, and we're pretty clear that these commitments are not being met. So a lot of the issues around FOLAW will be asking the big question of why? Why aren't these things happening? What's going on? So really thank you very much to Martin for setting the scene. We're going to go a bit of a round around the panelists now and ask them to respond. What has impacted on you when you've heard what Martin has said, and also, acknowledging that the FOLAW project or the FOLAW program will be coming along as a global platform. We've already got the child projects, in some cases running and others being formulated. So there's a lot of happening in that space. So I'd like to ask Mohammed, of course, from the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, which is a big backer or the backer of FOLAW. So when it comes to this, Mohammed, could you just respond to what you've heard from Martin? So over to you, Mohammed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for the wonderful opportunity to have this session as part of the Global Landscapes Forum. First of all, let me respond to Martin by acknowledging the great appreciation that we have for the World Bank's leadership of this program. As he clearly outlined, this is an ambitious global program with 27 countries across Africa, Asia, Central Europe, and Latin America. And it's actually the largest ever funded by the GEF to tackle global environmental challenges from a driver's perspective. We believe that the bank's leadership is fantastic, given its strength, as outlined by Martin, and comparative advantage in the agriculture and food space, as well as its commitment to influencing transformative policy options. One thing he pointed out is the platform. We think that the platform is actually owned by the bank and the partners that have been mobilized, and we see it as an opportunity to really exercise this great influence that we need to make a dent in the food system, towards moving it towards sustainability and resilience, and tackling all of the inefficiencies as the presentation demonstrated. And in the 2 minutes I have remaining, Chris, I just want to outline a little bit, build a little bit on what was the underlying principles behind the GEF focus, because I think even though we are the force behind the program, our financing, as you saw from the numbers, is actually very small relative to the scale of the co-financing that is brought in by the bank and the countries that are involved. Now, first of all, there are several principles that underpin the program. One is the fact that we are tackling drivers of environmental degradation. So we know that there's huge amount of resources already being mobilized for transforming food systems, focusing mainly on some of the innovations and technologies required to increase productivity. So what we are bringing in is emphasis on the environment aspect, particularly climate change and biodiversity conservation. We know for sure biodiversity loss is driven largely by agriculture. The second the second principle has to do with integration. So we believe that all of the factors that have been highlighted are interlinked. You can't address one without addressing the other. And so by pushing for an integrated approach, we are acknowledging the fact that solutions need to be integrated and holistic. It's all the systems transformation. So we don't want to just move the needle a little bit. We want to transform the system in a way that we can shift it towards sustainability and resilience. So we are tackling both the horizontal dimension, the spatial aspects of production, dealing with the governance, the policy reforms needed, as well as the vertical dimension, which is the food chain, the food value, food chain commitments, as you mentioned, Chris, and the financing aspects as well. And then the fourth is the multi-stakeholder aspect. So we're working with coalitions, we are advocating that we're recognizing that systems transformation cannot be done by any one entity. It requires collective action. And so we're excited to see the FOLO program already mobilizing some key players in the food space, such as the Food and Land Use Coalition, the Good Growth Partnership, the Global Landscapes Forum, FAO, and UNDP and others. And then most importantly is the country ownership. So even though we're using the term child projects, it's really just a construct of the GLF modality, but it's the engagement of the countries that is actually quite critical. And 27 countries will have a tremendous influence on policies, approaches, and options that will drive some of the change that we're talking about in this commodity space. So let me stop there, and then we'll see what the next questions will be.
No, thank you, Mohammed. I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, we really do appreciate the way the GLF is really backing a lot of this work, and particularly backing the FOLO, global platform and the projects that we're talking about in the countries. So thank you very much for that. And we'll come back to you with some more questions about where you fit in this space and so on. So over to Bernard. You've set up, and you're the president and the co-founder or the founder of the Livelihood Venture Fund. Can you tell us, when you hear about these huge challenges, you hear about the hidden costs, you hear about where there's a lot of public money in the system, but maybe arguably misplaced in the system. Where do you think that you can leverage? What is your space in this sector? Over to you, Bernard.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody, and good afternoon. The livelihoods funds, there are now 3 funds, and a fourth fund coming soon. There are the Livelihoods Carbon Fund and the Livelihoods Fund for Family Farming. Those funds have been created by the private sector, by companies that have taken commitment, and they want to make this transformation happen. It is not just about commitment, it's about how to achieve. And this is where the difficulty starts. When you want to implement at scale in your supply chain or in energy consumption throughout your supply chain, your commitments. And I would say that the difficulty we are facing is that there is a lot of, as you said, public money. The difficulty is how can we use efficiently this public money? In many cases, we face programs which are designed by public entities, governments, and so on, instead of starting from the business itself. And here, in our case, we start from what are the main challenges of the supply chain, and how now, based on the reality of the supply chain, with the complexity of the supply chain, how can we increase the sustainability of the system? And it's a deep transformation of it, making a coalition in the long term. Coalition, in our case, means 20 years for restoration of ecosystem, and 10 years on supply chain project. So in this particular case, we need to have a very flexible approach to pre-financing the project and also on payment for results that are achieved. And in most cases, the rigidity of the programs are not very easy to adapt to the specific needs of the business actors in the supply chains. So we probably need to start more from the business realities and see how we can, in a way, push the business to go much beyond what they do today on sustainability and helping them transforming their supply chain. Instead of starting from public program, which are strategic approach, and then trying to engage the private sector in those public programs.
Thank you very much, Bernard. I mean, it's really, really interesting to appreciate that the fund has come out of a very strong commitments from the private sector. I think that's really important because we're always looking at the ownership of this agenda, how companies or brands and a lot of the other companies, you know, they make commitments, but it's a question of the complexity of delivery. How do they deliver that in a partnership? And as you say, that coalition, a very strong word. Now, at this time, we're going to jump now to Christopher Stuart with Olam International, the global head of sustainability. Olam, a large multinational, a significant player across multiple geographies, across multiple commodities, facing huge challenges within this environmental space on how business is operating. So over to you, Christopher. Can you shed some light on how Olam is approaching a lot of these issues and responding to Martin at this stage? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris, for the introduction and for inviting me onto this panel. So in response to the presentation that we heard, I mean, what really stands out, and we've heard this many times now, that the global food system isn't fit for purpose. I would argue that in fact it's a spectacularly well-designed machine, which has been designed for the wrong things. It's been designed to deliver food as cheaply as possible, principally to the wealthy markets of the world. And in doing that, we've designed it to ignore all of the externalities in terms of the cost to farmers and the environment. So it's not so much that the food system is broken, it's been designed for the wrong things. Or it's been designed to answer not the full range of questions. So, you know, food has been getting cheaper, it's far more diverse, far more accessible than it's ever been before. And for most of the wealthy countries of the world, it's a much smaller part of the household budget than it was 30 or 50 years ago. But the result of that is that obviously that the food that we eat, the majority of it is produced in a way that's unsustainable. And whilst consumers increasingly are demanding sustainable food and putting huge pressure on the brands and the retailers to deliver sustainable food, in fact, there's been a huge gap between what they say they want and what they're willing to pay for. So for the last 20 years, food companies like ours, who supply the global brands and retailers, have been trying to do that in a very piecemeal and fragmented approach by following certification schemes, the voluntary multi-stakeholder schemes that have been set up with, you know, through a huge process of dialogue with NGOs, companies, regulators, and so forth. But basically setting out standards and principles for how sustainable food should be produced, and putting a label on it, and hoping that customers would pay a premium on it. And in fact, you know, and obviously you need to have that premium because in our world, returning the value upstream to where food is produced costs money, and therefore consumers need to pay more, or the principle was that consumers need to pay more to get good food. But in fact, that model has failed because consumers, by vast majority, choose cost first and brand value second, and sustainability as a distant third, whatever they may say they do. So in fact, what we need to do is actually change the system and deliver sustainable food, not through a market premium on what sustainable food consists of, but actually routing unsustainable food out of the system, making it more expensive than it is. And in order to do that, we need to address the whole range of perverse subsidies and decisions on food production that makes it more difficult and more expensive to produce food sustainably than it is to produce it unsustainably, which is the current problem. And I'll maybe come back a little bit to what our vision, the market mechanism for that might look like in a little while.
Yeah, well, thank you, Chris. I think that really gives a very interesting dimension, where we create such a fantastic machine and deliverable and on time and so on and so forth. But at what cost, at what expense, and where is the focus of that delivery? Where is the focus of that created machine? I think that's a really, really interesting perspective, and it's great to hear, a strong view coming from the private sector on how you collaborate. Tanya, over to you. With IFC Advisory Services, in the space you've been hearing, what Martin has laid out and this challenges we're facing, how is that in the IFC space? What are you hearing and how is it coming together? Over to you, Tanya.
Thank you, Chris. Hello, everybody. I think what Christopher just said really resonated with me because the objective of IFC as an investor in the agribusiness sector in emerging markets is to make sustainability a business driver, because there's just no other way that we're going to need to get to where we need to go. For those of you who don't know IFC, today our investment portfolio in agribusiness and forestry in emerging markets is approximately $4 billion. And we invest across all aspects of the value chain and all of the different subsectors, from inputs to horticulture, from primary production to retail and distribution. And of course, being a development institution, all of our investments must at the very minimum comply with our environmental and social practices, but we know that that's not enough today. And so the advisory business of IFC really helps our clients go beyond the immediate compliance objectives and see how overarching sustainability commitments could be achieved. I think the challenge is that many of the sustainability commitments reside in fixing the supply chain, which for the most part is really outside the factory gate of our clients. And frankly, they have very limited control over what happens in that space. And that's why I think it's really important to recognize that while the private sector is a key stakeholder in this process, it cannot do it alone. And what we need is a concerted effort with the public sector and also civil society organizations to actually get this right. So what Bernard said really resonated with me from this angle, because there's so many different incentives, very many practical challenges on the ground. And unless we actually look at this from a systematic point of view and try to address the different pieces of the ecosystem, we're just never going to solve the problem. And that's probably why we're seeing, despite the commitments, a relative paucity of results on the sustainability agenda on the ground. I think we're learning in a very hard way that it's impossible to just fix one aspect of the agricultural value chain. You actually have to fix multiple aspects and have to do them at the same time. And the complexity is such that it's not just about agribusiness, it's also about infrastructure, it's about logistics, it's about health and education, just to name a few. So the complexity is quite enormous. But this is why I think the Fuller Initiative is so interesting, because it brings together the right stakeholders, the development community, of course, but the public and the private sector, to see what mix of these initiatives can actually help us get to scale. And I'll be happy to share some of the examples and some, I guess, green shoots that we're seeing in our experience further down in the discussion. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much, Tanya. That really does show the area that you're working in this space, and it also shows the concerns about how these linkages are operating, or they need to operate. So we're going to go to Craig Hansen from WRI. Obviously, WRI has become a really large voice in this space, and we're very thankful of the advice and the issues that you bring to the table. I mean, now the respective WRI, you're science-led, you're very, very good on data. So over to you, Craig. Where do you see this session? Where do you see this food system going? Over to you.
Great, thank you, Chris. And First of all, congratulations to the Global Environment Facility, the World Bank, and all the partners in launching the Fowler Impact Program. I think this is a huge opportunity, and I believe, as either Martijn or as Mohammed mentioned, this is one of the largest, if not the largest, program that Jeff has launched, perhaps even in its history. And you know, Deborah and I were pleased to be engaged with this as Deborah and also as a member of the Food and Land Use Coalition, who have been pushing this agenda for some time now. The FOLU Coalition is a happy and engaged partner in this impact program. I mean, this is a big deal. I'll just make 3 points to that I think will support many of the comments that the previous speakers have made. I mean, first of all, this issue of the food system, I would argue, is one of the most important issues that the world faces. It's like to say, at the end of the day, it's about food, fuel, and footnotes, right? If you think about the human quest for sustainability, it really is driven by the human quest for two things. It's food, given the fact that the food system impacts so much in terms of livelihoods, our own nourishment, as well as the environment. Think of all the environmental issues that are driven by the food system: loss of biodiversity, a quarter of all GHG emissions on the planet, you name it, right? And at the same time, governments fall when food is not sufficiently provided. The other issue is fuel, energy, right? Think of all the environmental impacts the energy system actually has on climate change, pollution, et cetera. Yet we all need energy for economic development. And again, governments fall if energy is not being provided to its citizens. The rest, you could argue, is a bit of a footnote. And so I really would like to congratulate the World Bank, the Jeff, and others for really honing in on this food systems issue. I think it's been heavily overlooked throughout history, and now is the time. And we've seen the wave of interest in this issue. I think the Fowler IP is recognized as one of the major drivers in helping to advance this agenda. So that's my first point. This is super, super important. Secondly, is to achieve success, we have to break down silos, right? As many of the other speakers have mentioned, no one entity has all the answers. No one entity can actually drive the change. We need private sector involved, and the Fowler IP has brought in a lot of private sector actors, which is fantastic. Chris there from Olam. Olam's doing fantastic things in trying to drive this agenda. You need government as well. Government controls a lot of the land. Government controls a lot of the financing that goes to this sector, et cetera. So again, the Fowler IP, well designed, in fact, it's engaging a number of governments. You need intergovernmental organizations. You need financial institutions, right? All play a role in helping to create a more sustainable food system. And it's not just one sliver, it's the entire supply chain. One of the insights that's been driven by the Fowler IP, the FOLU Coalition has written a lot about this, Deborah has written a lot about this, is it's supply chains really matter here, and that's actually how you can affect change. You have to capture the power, and then upstream and downstream information flows and market signals that supply chains provide. So we have to break down silos. The Fowler IP is designed to do that. And finally, we have to remember at the end of the day, it's about produce, protect, and prosper. The world needs to produce the right food, the nourishing food for the right people at the right time, right? That's fundamental, right? Fundamental human need. At the same time as we produce that food, we need to protect the natural ecosystems that remain, right? The world, science is very clear. We depend upon these natural ecosystems, not only for climate, but for pollination, for their water systems, for the rainfall and the grain belts, you name it. At the same time, people have to prosper. Otherwise, the political will on this agenda will not actually fly. Citizens, local communities, farmers have to find a way to prosper under this new sustainable food system agenda. Otherwise, it will all fall apart. So produce, protect, and prosper, all three at the same time, a grand challenge, but one that we have to achieve. Thank you.
No, thank you, Craig. That's very, very inspiring, those words, and we really appreciate your presence in this. I just wanted to sort of build on a couple of things you said there. Like, I was always fascinated on the debates about agriculture and energy. You mentioned it, but it's incredible how agriculture contributes to energy as well. You know, when we look at the conversation around palm going into biofuels, when we look about corn going into ethanol, so there is a more and more stress and more pull on agriculture, not just for the food system, but also for the energy systems as well. Sometimes we get a little bit lost on the renewable energy debate, which is also putting stress on the agriculture and the food systems as well. So there's a lot going on in this space. I wanted to come to Bernard, and I've got a few questions now for the panelists. I mean, you've all had your say. So over to Bernard, and I want to ask you, that how do we actually leverage these private sector commitments to increase investment in equitable value chains? You're very much working in the finance side. So how do you see this more leverage that can be done for the private sector commitments and to increase investment? Where are the opportunities? How can that work?
Well, I think what's going on in the private sector from my point of view is that companies are increasingly embarking in a real change. So far, involvement in the supply chain was done through certification. Certification was more about protecting the reputation of brands. It was more about reducing the risks, reducing the use of bad practices, whether it is ecological or social or whatever. And we are gradually moving from this certification approach, which probably was useful at the time, to something which is more a fundamental transformation of the supply chain. And this is where the difficulty is. How can we make this systemic change? First, as it was said before, I think the major actors will be the farmers. It's not about deciding from the top of large corporations that a supply chain have to move. Is it how can we partner with farmers in a way that there is a win-win systemic change? It is not just imposing another layer of complexity, another burden on the shoulders of farmers. And in a way, certification has been a bit like that, which is you should not do that. You should avoid doing that. And you have to sign. And if you sign, you will have some kind of premium, which is, we are moving from this approach gradually. It's now, let's say 90% of the money that is spent on sustainability is through certification, basically, so far, today. We need to gradually move to that. Now, the difficulties is who, there are two main issues. One is transformation, systemic transformation needs time. So who is ready to invest in long-term projects? I mentioned 10 years before. Not so easy in a supply chain to convince your suppliers, but also your customers to engage on contractual commitments to purchase from a certain area in a certain commodities on 10 years. And another issue is pre-financing. And pre-financing means who is ready to put the money on the table. And the third one is how can we build a system on real result-based payment? So far, for me, it's a matter of conferences. We talk a lot about result-based payment, but we could do it in the supply chain. We could ask the business, if the business commits to purchase in a sustainable way, to have some pre-financing and result-based payments. It is something that we could absolutely imagine, but so far it's not done. So how can we create coalitions which are really operational between NGO, private sector, farmers organization, and public entities like the one who are represented today, and of course, national governments. This is really what is at stake. We have some good examples where it works. We have large-scale projects in vanilla, in Madagascar, in coconut, in Philippines, cocoa in Ghana, and so on, that prove that it is possible to have long-term commitment, a business model, and at the end of the day, and the question was raised, is who pays for it? Is it the consumer who will pay for it? In most of the cases we have today is, yes, but this transition has a high cost, and I am not sure that my customers or my consumers will accept to pay a bit more for that. And that's one of the bottlenecks we have today.
No, thank you, Bernard. I mean, you really are, getting into the operational detail and the challenges of operationalizing sustainability, bringing sustainability into your business model. When I look at my screen, I see people nodding and I see a lot of enthusiasm, and I see Christopher Stuart. I could imagine you jumping in on that conversation. You were nodding strongly. So could you just say a few words, around that topic, and then we'll move on to some other things. So over to you, Christopher. You're muted. Yeah, there you go.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, I did. I wanted to stand up and applaud, actually, because Bernard has articulated so very clearly from the business perspective what the challenge is, and coming back to the other comment that we heard earlier, creating a market system for the incentives is critical, obviously, because the sustainability can only work if there is if every stage of the food value chain perceives its own interest and creates value at that stage of the chain. So, sort of the top-down solutions that are just sort of imposing a requirement from the end without considering the interests of the farmers themselves can only work in quite limited circumstances. So I think that we have to really think about what this new system can look like and what it means to bring together stakeholders around a long-term commitment to creating sustainable agricultural systems within real places. And that's really been a lot of the focus of OLAM over the last few years, after a decade of really concentrating on farmer livelihoods as the core of what OLAM is, considers to be sustainability. We also realized that you can't achieve sustainability for the farmers and the smallholders, of which we interact probably with around 5 million smallholders. You can't do that also without considering the place in which they work, the landscape in which they live and work, and where their jobs are created, and where also ecosystems exist that support those farmers through rainfall and water regulation and so forth. So we need to have, we've been concentrating in the last few years on trying to articulate what the business case for sustainable landscapes looks like, and bringing really that traceability of food back to the place where it comes from, so that we can really propose to our own customers, who are hugely important stakeholders for us. We can show them what we're doing. We can show them the footprint of their food in a really detailed way, and have a really serious discussion with them about what their commitments, their long-term commitments, and their ambitions are on sustainability, so that together we can change the way that the food is produced. And that's really about measuring the right things and working in the landscape that we source from to improve things, not just by having a checklist that we tick off and say, this part of the food supply chain meets a number of rules, but actually having a continuous improvement system and plan in place, and measuring accurately what the impact and outcome of our activities looks like. And that's really, I think, where this discussion needs to go, is actually how do we convince more of the private sector to participate in platforms where we can aggregate up from the farm level up to the landscape, so that we can reach a scale where the benefits of sustainable production are evident, not just to in the food system, but to the governments, the financiers, and all the other stakeholders.
Yeah, hello. I'm thinking I'm having. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Okay, having a bit of an internet problem there. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, it's a bit tricky. Thank you very much. I just want to come Hamid now. When you hear of all what's being said, I mean, this finance is coming up as well. So where you're sitting in the Global Environment Facility, I mean, how do you reach the financing and mention, but what else do you see happening in this space to link finance to that? Because Jeff is obviously very, very working across multiple partners. You know, you do a lot of work with the private sector as well as the platforms and so on. I want to say a few words about that. That would be great. So just before you come on, as you unmute, just to the audience that's listening in, please feel free to send us any questions through the chat, and we have people watching and monitoring who'll let me know if there's any questions to answer. So Mohammed, up to you. You're muted.
Thank you very much, Chris. And thank you very much. And yeah, it's been quite inspiring listening to the panelists. All the speakers have shared some very really inspiring perspectives on how we can proceed from where we are. I think you know, let me just put things into context, because there was a real rationale behind the FOLU program, which is more or less driven by a lot of what I've heard so far. And our CEO, who comes from a finance background, has been very a strong leader in terms of motivating these kind of perspectives. So of course, that's the starting point for our engagement. But you mentioned earlier, Chris, in your opening, about all the commitments that were out there. So we know that there is goodwill both on the public and the private sector side in terms of willingness to shift and move things towards sustainability, even if those targets that were set 10 years ago haven't been met. But at least we know the problem is not the willingness, it's that connectivity and that interaction between the different players that was missing. And we are beginning to see that again. Now there's commitments to zero waste, circular economy in the food chain. We're seeing targets being set for landscape restoration, anchored around the Bonn Challenge, the Africa 100, and so on and so forth. There's the Trillion Trees initiative to restore. All of these opportunities have financing behind them by various interest groups, including commitment by the private sector. So I think what we need is a mechanism to really align these interests and start to coalesce in this space so that we can actually move these commitments into tangible actions on the ground. I think that's what we in the GLF are very committed to, and we're very fortunate to have a clientele in the form of countries that are committed through the conventions that we serve as financial mechanism, where they demand real change that are quantifiable, measurable. And so for us, it's pretty clear that we see these opportunities already now beginning to emerge, and which more or less drove the way we structured the program around key commodity chains, key staples where real change is happening, where there's momentum being built, whether you're talking about rice, there's a sustainable rice platform, cocoa, there's a cocoa and forest initiative in West Africa, and then of course, oil palm and soybean. All of these have very strong coalitions around them. So what we need is a mechanism to infuse this thinking into that space to ensure that we can start moving commitments into actions on the ground. In the countries and the geographies that we've targeted, we're selected specifically to ensure that we can reach these global environment benefit targets that the GLF is actually committed to helping countries achieve. And so for us, the end game, obviously, from a finance perspective, comes into shifting that needle on how much resources is being channeled to build efficiency into the system, reduce waste, so that we can have these global environment benefits accruing and ensuring that the food systems operates within the planetary boundaries. We're not exceeding where we are in terms of externalities, loss of biodiversity, deforestation, greenhouse gas emissions, and then of course protecting, as Craig mentioned, protecting those systems that provide a lot of the services on which agriculture is dependent. So it's pretty clear what we need to do. And that's why we are really inspired by the bank's leadership, because we know that the World Bank as an institution by itself has all the elements in place to really drive this change in a very coherent and consistent manner, and moving us from business as usual to something that is actually quite practical. So let me stop there and again, thank all the speakers for their perspectives.
No, great. Thank you, Mohammed. I mean, we really appreciate that. backing. I'm coming to Tanya. What's really interesting, Tanya, you are a partner in the FOLO. We're really looking for support of IFC on how you're going to help us, structure much more of our support and role in terms of the private sector. It's happening in IFC. IFC is looking at scaling up more work in the agribusiness space. Good if you could look at this area of it, on bridging more finance. How are we bridging finance between the performance gap of the global commitments and positive action on the ground? So over to you, Tanya.
Thank you, Chris. Look, we heard a lot about the challenges that the private sector is facing in meeting the commitments. And I think Christopher talked a lot about that there's no more a price premium in this market, right? We have to figure out a business case for sustainability to make it work. Martine talked about the inadequate policy environment, and others have referred to it. I just want to touch upon another maybe 2 points that we are trying to help our clients address. And one is data. And unless you actually have data that's credible and transparent, we're not going to be able to move the needle. And it's not just the private sector's job to provide this data. I think this is also where the public sector has a huge role to play, and the civil society as well. So, for example, even if a client of ours wanted to prove that they have no deforestation in their supply chain in one of the countries, they may not be able to actually get the data to prove that that's the case, just because either they cannot access the land rights of the farmers, or the data just simply isn't there, right? And so how do we work at the level of each country and commodity to actually enable data to be out there and to be transparent and to be accessible, to me is a huge agenda item. And for example, we're now working with the Smithsonian Institution to Paraguay to do a map, biodiversity map of the Chaco region with some of the good growth partner members in the country. So for the first time, actually, both financial institutions, private investors, local companies will be able to use data like this to drive their investment decisions and their financing decisions, right? So how can we actually replicate an experience like this, assuming that it works, and take this to the other sectors and countries? And the second issue that I think we have to talk more about is what do we do with the smallholder supply chains? Because frankly, when you're working with large farmers, it's much easier, right, to have the business case and to have a lot of control over production practices and what they do. When we're talking about smallholders, it's a different ballgame, and many of our clients struggle with smallholder-based supply chains, especially in Africa and Asia. And here, it's not just about knowledge. It is about incentives. But fundamentally, it's also about the mindset change, right? What we're seeing over and over again is that at the smallholder farmer level, people don't necessarily think about their operation as a business. And if they don't think about their operation as a business, they are unlikely to have the trade-off decisions about what they put into their soil, right? How they irrigate it, what they plant, and what they sell. And so, frankly, I think a lot of us are in the business of mindset change, and this is something that takes time, and it's not easy. So for me, I think we need to focus on the smallholder agenda in a much more comprehensive way, and stop thinking just about the productivity lens, but start thinking about the mindset and how do I see my operation. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, we do have some good examples where our clients, with the support from us, but also other partners in the World Bank, are making progress. And I'm really hoping that we could use the FOLO platform as a way to learn from what went right. I'm a big believer in taking what's worked and what's worked well, and then taking it into the other sectors so we could scale that up.
Great, thank you very much, Tanya. It's really fascinating what IFC is doing now, really on the ground. I've got some questions coming on the chat line. I've got one for Craig. There's a question coming up. I think this is kind of interesting. It says, why now? What's happening right now that makes FOLO so timely? Interesting perspective for WI. So why now? Is it the right time, or should we wait? I don't want to wait, but is it the right time?
No, definitely don't wait. Right? We should have been doing this a while ago, right? But why now? I think a number of reasons. Look at the private sector. Look at the number of initiatives that are out there on, for instance, trying to get deforestation out of commodity supply chains, right? The Tropical Forest Alliance, et cetera. You're seeing a number of private sector companies, Olam and others, who are setting commitments because they want to, but also because there's also demand here from consumers as well as from NGOs for trying to, say, tackle some of these issues on boosting yields on existing land while reducing pressure to go into, say, tropical forests. So there's a movement afoot amongst the private sector, I would say amongst some consumers around the planet. There's also a lot of interesting in the interest amongst governments. I think the climate change discussion over the past few years has opened up its eyes to the importance of the food system as a major contributor to greenhouse gases emissions right now, and as a major solution to climate change going forward. And so you're starting to see that dialogue among national governments on the climate agenda. And finally, you know, COVID's kind of reminding us of food insecurity issues, right? Whether it's food that's being grown and can't make it to market in Western countries, or even the lack of labor in other places around the planet as the workers become exposed to COVID. It's raising this issue of the food system and what is a healthy and safe and ultimately sustainable food system. I think now is the time for us to come with an answer to that question.
Thanks very much, Craig. That's really clear. So obviously the time is always right. It's never wrong, which is great. Mohammed, I've got a question that's coming for you. It says, what does success look like for you? And I suppose it's not specifically you. I'm sure it's the Global Environment Facility. It's not all on your shoulders. But what does success look like for you of the FOLAW program? You know, just to acknowledge to the audience that the FOLAW is a 7-year program. So this is, you know, and this is back to what Bernard was talking about, that time, you know, time is required. So we've got all this time ahead of us. So I'm assuming we're going to still be in our jobs in 7 years. You know, we'll still be there at the helm and taking responsibility. But what does success look like for you or GEF in terms of FOLAW?
Thank you very much. Very good question. Well, of course, what we're all interested in, and I think all the panelists have expressed clearly, is to make the food system fit for purpose. And it's not something you deliver in 7 years. And so what we hope we can achieve in the time frame for which we have resources available, because of course GEF finances based on a limited time frame, not in perpetuity, is to ensure that we can work together to handle all of the weaknesses and challenges and bottlenecks that we have in the system, so that we can start to have a machinery that actually is fit for purpose. And if we do, then the winner is really it's the planet, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is to make sure that we keep this planet operating within a safe space. And the science has told us that that space is being stretched by the way we produce food, the way we process food, the way we transport food. And so by building all these efficiencies into the system, we will be essentially generating those environment benefits that ultimately accrue to the planet. We will reduce deforestation. We will reduce biodiversity loss. We will reduce eutrophication in our water bodies that is resulting from excessive use of nutrients and over withdrawal of water resources, freshwater resources, and also plastic waste, all of which is a byproduct of the food system inefficiencies. So I think success will look like for us when we have a system in place that is dealing with all of these challenges and really functioning in an efficient manner.
Great, thank you, Mohammed. I've got a question coming, Christopher. It's saying here you're developing a business case for investing in sustainable landscapes. You know, this is really interesting. You know, as a company, you know, you're in supply chain management, you're in commodities, but you're in these landscapes. You're working in these landscapes, and its question is if you're developing a business case for investing in sustainable landscapes, why have companies like Olam struggled to move beyond the narrow sustainability results, back to the certification point? No need to touch on that too much, and broaden the impacts at landscape level that consumers can appreciate and value. It's a bit of a longer question, but that's what's just come in. Is that clear to you, Christopher?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think this is actually quite a tough question, and
that's our audience, Christopher.
It's a tough question because food companies are very good indeed at thinking within the narrow remits of their supply chain. That is our business. Our business is the food supply chain. Yet sustainable food requires us to think outside of the confines of the supply chain itself and think about not just our own workers or our immediate suppliers, but the communities that they live in and the landscape that we work in. And so that requires a mindset shift and skills and capabilities that aren't ordinarily resident in food companies. So in order to make this shift, we as food companies, we actually need to, and food system supply chain companies, we need to be able to think about things that we're not ordinarily geared up to think about, including climate finance. I mean, this is an entire, 20-year plus sort of industry, which requires a lot of skills and a lot of knowledge that food companies don't have. And the other challenge, of course, is that if you're trying to think about landscapes, because food companies tend to be, so the food supply chain is extremely fragmented, even in its most consolidated forms. The most dominant companies typically don't control more than a small fraction of the overall market. So thinking about a landscape approach requires us to work together in a space where companies are extremely fiercely competitive. And to work together in that space is not easy, because we spend most of our other time fighting tooth and nail for very, very tiny advantages. And there's no standing still in this space, because if you stand still for a moment, somebody else is going to come and eat your lunch. So what we need to do is actually think in a new way about collaborating and define the collaboration space where we work in an aligned way towards reaching consensual and sort of coherent goals at a larger scale that we're normally used to thinking about, and to share data. To come back to Tanya's point about data and metrics, actually, in order to make the right sort of decisions, we need to supply the people who are taking those decisions, who are not just the food companies, but the public authorities, NGOs, local authorities, etc. We need to supply them with information and data, and therefore we need to be able to share that information and data safely, without sort of endangering our own commercial interests, and that's a complicated thing to do. So our CEO Sunny Verghese has called on food companies to share our impacts on the natural world, whether it's water, land, carbon, soils, to share it warts and all. And we need to find a way in which we can share that transparently whilst protecting our commercial interests, but to share it in a way that enables the collective impact of the food sector. Many companies, not just the 3 or 4 biggest ones in any landscape, but all the players, to share upwards and aggregate that data so that we can reach a scale where it becomes interesting for finance, insurance, climate finance, etc., to come in and pay for or finance the aspects that food companies can't themselves finance. We can't clearly do this alone. And what we're looking for is a way to match our very significant investments into the supply chain with the corresponding investments that are required to protect and regenerate the living world upon which we all depend. And so that, I think, is the big challenge. And just to complete on that, we think that the concept of landscapes and jurisdictions that effectively balance the interests of people and nature will intrinsically have a higher natural and social capital value, not just the financial value created out of the food, but doing the right thing will generate will generate not just the natural capital value, but also better livelihoods, better efficiencies and returns on assets, reduced risks for the investors, more diverse and better jobs around the food system. And that will have an impact on salaries and taxes and revenue to the governments, and reduced healthcare costs and all of the other things that go with actually the hidden costs of poorly managed landscapes, where the influence of poverty is a continuous kind of downward driver on human development. So it's really about creating. There's a business case, but it's a business case which is a non-traditional business case that involves creating value for more than just the financial actors. It also involves creating other sorts of value.
Thank you, Chris, for that. That's a very good response. I mean, it's a huge issue to go into detail. So we've only got about 10 minutes left. In the last 10 minutes, I've got 2 questions left. I've got a question that's coming for Tanya and a question that's coming for Craig. And then we're going to be asking Martin to give a little roundup towards the end as a response, because he presented, you've talked, you've questioned, you put some good comments together. So we'll get back to Martin. So question to Tanya is coming over the chat. Is that amongst your IFC clients, are you seeing an increasing number of clients that are trying to operationalize sustainability into their business model?
Definitely. And that's actually the positive side of things. I think we are now in the world where, with the coming of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the private sector jumped on that bandwagon much faster than even many of the governments. And I think it was extraordinary, the momentum that's generated. And I know we talked earlier today about the fact that the commitments are not being made or not being met as quickly as we would like. But I think there's still a huge value in putting out there a vision and having that leadership, because then it helps people drive towards something that they aspire to. So I think, in short, the answer is yes. But obviously, as we discussed, there's no easy way forward. And I think what's really important is that we take the pockets of success and we talk about them, and then we figure out how to make more of these pockets of success. Because unfortunately, as others have said, it is a very fragmented business. But we can draw examples from other industries where people have indeed come together in a fragmented way and tried to do things differently. So I think looking at the garment sector, for instance, and what happened over the last 20 to 30 years in terms of the whole labor agenda, right? Also a very fragmented business, but somehow the industry is beginning to come together and introduce new norms and practices. They have a long way to go, but I think even in a fragmented place, we can get it done.
It's good to hear that positive message that people are adapting and changing their business models. Craig, there's an interesting comment come for you. This is something I'm interested in as well. The Cocoa Forest Initiative. You, WRI, you released a report or an endorsement of a report, or under your Global Forest Watch, that Côte d'Ivoire and the rate of deforestation, of course, to cocoa, has been beginning. Can you tell us, is that success? Is that because of the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, or is that because of other factors? What can you tell us about?
Great, thank you, Chris. Yeah, so Global Forest Watch, a partnership convened by WRI. We monitor the status and trends of the world's forests every single year at 30-meter resolution, and we can also detect deforestation as it's happening. We can catch illegal loggers at work in Peru and give that information to the government so they can actually stop the destruction before it gets too large. So we launched earlier this week all the data from the planet for the year 2019, all the tree cover change over the year of 2019. And although if you look at the total planet, ever since satellite data has been going on, 2019 was the 3rd worst year in terms of loss of primary tropical forests on the planet. So we're not succeeding yet, right? But there were 3 glimmers of hope. One was Indonesia, 3rd year straight. Indonesia's loss of primary forest was very, very low. So they've actually had their work in terms of the moratorium on palm oil expansion, moratorium on peat, plantations on peat, has really worked. That's the evidence that it's actually having an impact. So 3 years in a row. If we first saw it 3 years ago, we're like, well, okay, it's a start, but let's see a few more years. It's a consistency. We're seeing effect here. That's actually very much of a bright spot in a more bleak world. Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, to your question, I talk about Indonesia because they are where Indonesia was just 2 years ago, right? So interesting to see the reduction in loss of forest. The question will be 2 more years from now. If we see consistency of low numbers, then you've got to change. It's good to see at the start here. Let's keep it up. Yes, as we identified in our analysis of the satellite data, one can point to the Forest Cocoa Initiative as likely something that's actually been having impact. It's put the attention of the governments and other companies on this issue. It's hard to show causality quite yet, but the timing is a bit interesting. So I do think that the Cocoa Forest Initiative is having a bite. The question now is, can they follow through? So I encourage the governments and the companies involved to keep the efforts going so that 2 years from now, we can say, yes, it is truly a success story.
Great. Well, no, thank you. I mean, I'm very encouraged to see that. And I'm sure that Jeff and Mohammed's been listening. Maybe, I don't want to go and say it, but I think FOLO is going to be benchmarked to your as well. I'm a little bit worried about that already. Well, hopefully we'll rise to the challenges. We're along it. I'm going to go back to Martin, our Global Director of Ag and Food, and ask Martin, have you got any closing remarks? You know, some reflection that have been said by the panelists and you've heard. It's been a very, very fruitful debate. I'll hand over to you and then I'll wind up. So thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you very much, for all the panelists. I think it was a very rich discussion, and I'm not going to make an attempt to kind of summarize it, but just picking up on a few points. You know, I think the point that Christopher made on the global food system, this perfect machine actually to produce cheap calories at a time, you know, when planetary boundaries are not yet on the radar screen of many. So, and what Greg was saying, you know, I mean, the time to act is now. So I want to, you know, a few reflections on that particularly. The thing is that in terms of the time is now, and if you look at I think the big question is, if you look at the returns of food system transformation, I mean, economically actually it's very attractive. So the question should be, why is it not already happening? And, you know, the FOLO report that came out on the 10 critical transitions last year indicates that there's a 5.7 trillion dividend, I mean, to be achieved by 2030 if those 10 critical transitions are being made. And if you then look at, you know, the $570 billion of public support to agriculture, and if you look at the various kind of stakeholders there, Bernard was saying, you know, I mean, farmers play a key role. If you look at this from the perspective of the farmers, it would actually make a lot of sense, I mean, to repurpose this public support, because right now, public support actually is failing, I mean, the farmers. Most of it is going to the larger farmers, and you know, what's the value of a fertilizer subsidy or a minimum price, I mean, if your crop fails. So in that sense, I mean, payment for ecosystem services provided by farmers would provide a much more stable revenue stream, I mean, to those farmers, and should therefore be in their interest. Also, one would expect, I mean, that the delivery of ecosystem services by farmers would improve the resilience of their production systems, which would reduce, I mean, the cost and improve the access to financing. So a lot of, you know, it would make a lot of economic sense, I mean, for the farmers to actually make this transition. If you would be a Minister of Finance, likewise, it would make a lot of sense, because you would be supporting global public goods rather than private goods, I mean, through input subsidies, as well as, I mean, to the extent that your public support, I mean, to agriculture in a particular country reduces the carbon footprint, I mean, this could also provide an opportunity to augment those support programs to climate finance, and it actually provides a good opportunity for the Green Climate Fund to come in and provide climate finance at scale at the sector-wide level. And for the private sector, you know, it would make a lot of sense, because a lot of the incentives are right now for the production of food grains rather than high-value agriculture. Well, consumer demand actually is shifting, I mean, towards high-value agriculture. So having a more level playing field in public support of food grains vis-a-vis high-value agriculture would provide better incentives for the private sector, I mean, to invest in agriculture. Now, despite all that, why is it not happening? So this is a huge political agenda as well. And I think this is the point I want to emphasize and follow up what Greg was saying. I mean, I think the time to act is now, because what we will see is because of COVID-19 and its impact, and its effect and its economic impact, it will cause a lot of fiscal stress, and it actually will force governments, I mean, to take a hard look at their public support programs, including for agriculture. And we're already noticing that, I mean, in our dialogue with governments, where we see governments coming forward. Also, the focus on healthy diets and the link between what I said in my presentation on healthy diets, pre-existing conditions. I think there will be more emphasis moving forward on taxing, I mean, the bad food and the unhealthy and poor diets. Of course, there's a political agenda there as well, but I could see more support, I mean, for that agenda moving forward. The efforts to prevent the next pandemic, I mean, investing in One Health, part of that also will be providing incentives for better and good agricultural practices. So that's also, I think, very important. And contributing that in creating a kind of the conditions for acting now. And lastly, Chris, is the whole focus on resilience, when you see the vulnerabilities of the food supply chains. There will be more interest in invest in digitization of those food supply chains, which in itself will also make it easier for farmers to connect to consumers and bring and with that actually, I mean, get maybe price premiums for the type of agricultural practices associated with the delivery of those products. So I think there are many dimensions that point in the direction that post-COVID-19 point in the direction that the time to act now will be more urgent and stronger than ever. So I think with those reflections, I hand it back to you, Chris. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. I'm getting a message that we have to close. I mean, a couple of minutes over our time frame, but I'd just like to say thank you very much for all the participation from the audience. Special thanks to the panel. It's been an immense pleasure to actually moderate this panel and connect on such an important section. So from the GLF, this session will now close, and forward to listening into the closing session of GLF, which will be starting shortly. So thank you very much. And thank you to all of the support that we've been given to all the GLF team. And of course, calling out the world, bring all this together as well for this session. So thank you very much. And we'll close now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. I'll be in touch with
Chris.
all
Thanks,
of you
everybody.
individually very much. Yeah, thank you, Art. In rural France, I think you're the best place at the moment. Take it easy, everybody. And Mohammed, I look forward to having further conversations with you.
Sure.
Thank you. Okay.
Thanks,
Bye,
Chris.
everybody.
Bye.